Taylor and I have been looking for a new wireless system for quite a long time. The Accsoon promises to be one of the quickest budget options on the market, but at what cost? Before we start, a big thanks to Accsoon for sending us this unit for review. Wireless video transmitters is something that we all rely on from time to time, not only to pull focus, but to provide clients with a clean image on set. This is the Accsoon Cineview Master 4K. It's Accsoon's latest crack at providing us with a wireless video transmission system that competes with higher-end units, but for much less money. Now, there are a number of things that we consider important when looking at a video transmitter, and today we're going to look at quite a few of those. So to start with, let's talk a little bit about what this unit does. In terms of physical build quality, it seems like it's mostly made out of metal and it's very sturdy. There is a fan inside, but we haven't really noticed that it gets particularly loud. The unit is fairly large compared to its competitors. It has multiple antennas, but that's to accommodate the 6 GHz wireless that it can do, which should help in terms of maintaining connection. And all of the antennas can be removed if you do want to swap them out for different types. Now, if you do swap them out, you might see a performance hit, but it's nice to note in case you break them. The transmitter features HDMI in and out, as well as SDI in that'll do up to 1080p, and the receiver features HDMI and SDI out. And transmitting 4K does come with a penalty to that speed, but it is still pretty snappy even if you do choose to do 4K. Both feature both NPF battery sleds as well as DC in for powering over DTAP. Now, there is a USB-C input on the transmitter, but unfortunately that's only for phone compatibility, so you can send your image to your phone over the cable. It's not for power. You can also get this pretty handy V-Lock adapter from Accsoon separately if you want a nice neat setup that goes in between your camera and your V-Lock battery and powers the device all in one. Okay, so what is this unit's claim to fame? I have to say it's probably the low latency. Compared to most other video transmitters in this price range, it is hands down the fastest that we've tested, especially in 1080p. Now, the unit does feature some pretty chunky antennas, but that's because it features tri-band wireless, which means it operates over several different wireless frequencies, including the 6 GHz spectrum. And that should allow it to stay connected over longer ranges and on more cluttered networks. When it comes to range, Accsoon claim about 2.5 kilometers with line of sight. We went to a nice open field of grass. I took the camera and a transmitter and I walked across the field for as far as I could until the image dropped out. Unfortunately, we didn't realize there was a bit of a hill. It wasn't a very big hill, but it was clearly enough that we lost line of sight, and the signal did drop out sooner than we expected. We got about 320 meters. Now, that's not to say that the device will only work up to 320 meters. It's just what we found in that specific test. And I also want to mention that while I was walking out, occasionally I would get in between the transmitter and the receiver, and the image would also drop out. So just because something has a really great range, if it is line of sight, doesn't mean that you can always rely on it. Now, do keep in mind, it's not unique to Accsoon, and in most cases, you're not going to be separated from your camera and transmitter that much, so I don't think this is going to be a big deal for most people. Something else I do also want to mention here is that if you're working on a production where you have a long range, what you'll typically see is that someone is going to run your antennas onto a stand and put them up in the air so they can maintain line of sight for longer. Something else that's useful is that you don't need to send the image to the receiver. You can send the image directly from the transmitter to a smartphone or a tablet running the Accsoon app. The app's pretty fully featured and has a lot of the tools that you might need in the field if you don't have a camera monitor, and it can even do recording for proxies. So when we got this, the thing that we were really interested in was seeing how it compared to the very similarly sized but much more expensive DJI system. So to start with, let's look at the physicals here. They've got similar inputs and outputs, and they are very similarly sized. Although I would say that if you've got the V-Lock adapter on, the DJI is a little bit smaller, or at least it feels a little bit more compact compared to the Accsoon. But I don't think there's too much in it either way. But what I will say is that the DJI itself has felt a little bit large for me in the past when I have used it on my cameras, and I feel the same about the Accsoon. Now let's talk speed. If you're using both devices in 1080p mode, we have found that the Accsoon is noticeably faster than the DJI. However, if you swap it over to 4K mode, we found that they trade places and the Accsoon becomes slightly slower than the DJI. So, in other words, the DJI sits in between the performance of the 1080p mode and the 4K mode. The reason why we wanted to test this is because claimed rated speeds aren't necessarily comparable because we don't really know how each manufacturer tests their stuff. However, when we put them side by side, it was pretty obvious to see what was going on. There is a bit of an elephant in the room here. Is the 4K actually worth using? Oh, that was a good one. Yeah. I like that. Taylor and I have actually gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. I won't bore you with the technical details because it can get a little bit overwhelming, but what we found is that the 4K mode does have some extra details. However, it looks like Accsoon had to drop the bitrate in order to get up to 4K, which means that you get what's called macro blocking, those big pixelated blocks that move around the screen on YouTube or other highly compressed platforms. This means that while the image might be sharper in places, in other places, especially where there's movement, or for example your focus plane is moving when you're trying to pull focus, we found it quite blocky and soft and actually harder to pull focus in 4K versus 1080p, which is then hurt by the fact that the 4K is also slower than the 1080p. And this macro blocking is only going to be made worse the worse your connection quality is and the more your camera's moving. For example, if you're shooting handheld or maybe if you're doing a car move or something like that. And unfortunately, it gets a little bit worse from here. When we were doing our testing, we noticed that the image quality, even in 4K, doesn't seem to be that much improved over the previous Accsoon Cineview model. And the reason why I mention this as being a problem, what we found is that when you look at the other competitors' models, including the DJI transmission, and much cheaper models from competitors like Hollyland, we found that the DJI and the Hollyland actually have a much better image quality than any of the Accsoons. I'm not sure how compressed it's going to look over YouTube, but trust us, it's not even close. Now don't get us wrong, we didn't expect this device to have similar performance to the much more expensive DJI system, but it gets a little bit problematic for us when you compare it to much cheaper units like the Hollyland, and again, that's a bit of a bummer considering the size and price of this unit. Now don't get me wrong, it is usable, but I think if I were purchasing, I'd find it pretty hard to take one of these units over a cheaper unit that has better image quality, where my client is going to be seeing a better image. It's also worth keeping in mind that while this unit might be faster than the other cheaper units, if the image quality isn't good enough, we think it doesn't really matter. Now we did talk about this problem with Accsoon. We sent our original kit back to them so they could test it and they sent us a new one for review. We found exactly the same performance on the new kit, and they claim that the kit that they received from us is performing within their expectations. So that about wraps up our image quality testing. But let's now talk a little bit about some of the other negatives that we found while using this unit. And hopefully some of these will be able to be addressed with firmware by Accsoon in the future. Now to start with, the boot up time on these is pretty lengthy, and again we found the previous cheaper version to be quicker, and that's a little bit disappointing to see. Another thing that we noticed is Accsoon has made a new app, and it has most of the same features and even some new ones, which is pretty cool. We tested this unit on several different productions. Taylor took it on some, we had some friends take it on some, and I took it on a big brand film as well. Most of us had a pretty great time with it and didn't have any connectivity issues. I, on the other hand, had some dropouts and couldn't get it to reconnect, and we just kind of had to put it aside and use a different unit. One more thing we did want to mention is that Accsoon have actually added a 9 onto the end of the default password when connecting the system to a phone. We asked them why this was the case, and even the original manuals that we got didn't mention this, and they said it's because this is a new version, it has an extra wireless band, so they needed that extra number on the end because it made sense. I'm not sure that I agree, but just keep in mind, if you're having trouble connecting it, it's because you're probably missing that last new digit that they haven't mentioned. Another thing that we noticed, navigating the menus on these devices is clunky. It's quite hard to understand exactly what's going on, and it's all quite fiddly to navigate. For example, one of the things that we found quite confusing is the bitrate selection. So the setting goes up to 12, but apparently the number has nothing to do with the actual technical transmission rate of the device. It's just a number that they picked out of thin air, which is a little bit confusing for the user. And also, what is N12 versus U12? I don't particularly understand or care to. I wish it were a little bit simpler to understand. Okay, there's something else that we do also want to mention here that we noticed when we were using this device. While you can do 4K 60, which is nice, it can't do DCI 4K, which means that if you're recording in a cinema aspect ratio, it'll drop all the way back down to HD. That's a big problem because cameras like my A-cam here, the Canon C400, when you're shooting RAW 6K, it's a DCI aspect ratio. The camera can output 4K DCI as a monitoring resolution, but the Accsoon can't see it. I have to drop all the way down to 2K for it to sync back up, and that really sucks. We do also want to talk briefly about this V-Lock unit. While we think it's pretty cool and a pretty neat addition, it doesn't actually have a locking connector, and it just connects with a DC wire. It also has a little bit of flex, and Taylor has found himself using bongo ties to hold it all together. Overall, it just feels a little bit like an afterthought. Okay, so let's wrap things up. Unfortunately, I know this review hasn't sounded particularly positive. And to be clear, we don't necessarily think that this unit is a dud. I think the main thing though is that given the size and the relative cost compared to the competition, we were disappointed to see the image quality compromises. What we think has happened here is that Accsoon have both rushed this out to market and have also needed to compress the video heavily in order to send it quicker. Now this is just our assumption, so we could be wrong, but as big fans of Accsoon and their previous products, we are disappointed by what they've brought to the table here. In terms of our recommendation, I don't think either Taylor or I are comfortable recommending this product unless you really need one of the features that it has. I think I'm far more inclined to recommend that you either spend more to get either the DJI or a Teradek system if you need high quality, low latency video, or spend less and get fantastic previous versions from Accsoon. I know this sounds a bit brutal, but at the end of the day, the image quality on offer here just is not good enough for the price tag, even if it is a little bit quicker. Now, with all of that said, we will leave a link down in the description for if you did want to pick up one of these for yourself, and maybe we'll leave a link down below for one of their previous versions that is a lot cheaper and has very similar image quality, even if it is a little bit slower. If you like what you see here, give us a like and a subscribe, and we'll see you next time.